Alright, so I got an update here for you guys on our bipartisan pro-war duopoly that we have here in the United States, as there was a recent piece of legislation that was introduced by Matt Gaetz, of all people, who was basically trying to push for the United States to withdraw our troop presence in Syria, which has not been approved by Congress. So, here from The Intercept, we got a breakdown from Ryan Grimm and Daniel Boguslaw, and they say House hawks kill bipartisan effort to end the war in Syria. Matt Gaetz sponsored a resolution in the House supported by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. Okay, like to see that, right? For once, the CPC actually backing something that is good here and standing firm on it. Now, we're going to get to the actual vote tallies here in a minute, and you'll see that not even close to the entirety of the Congressional Progressive Caucus voted for this, but they say they were trying to force congressional oversight of the continued U.S. military presence in Syria. Okay, so here we start off with a quote from Matt Gaetz directly. He says, "Syria is my leadoff hitter. We're going to take a trip around the globe. We may go to Yemen." Okay, that would be a great thing, right? You remove our, ongoing support for the Saudi-led genocide in Yemen. 100% in support of that. We may have stops in Niger. We may have stops in Sudan. Maybe ultimately will end in Ukraine. Okay, so I think that there's a little bit of a difference between Ukraine and these other ones that we're talking about here. I mean, obviously the United States has covert operations going on in dozens of countries around the world and all of that nefarious stuff as well. But when you're talking about Ukraine, I mean, I obviously understand questions and debates surrounding, how much aid are we giving them? What kind of aid are we giving them? Are we actually trying to push for some sort of a diplomatic resolution to this war? Are we walking ourselves up to a whole bunch of different red lines that once we cross them, we might not be able to come back from, right? I get all of that conversation and debate surrounding Ukraine, but it is kind of a little bit different when you're sending weapons to Ukrainians to defend their own territory versus other situations like in Syria, where you actually have a direct U.S. presence there with like boots on the ground American troops. So, maybe he'll introduce some sort of a different piece of legislation on Ukraine, but a lot of the aid packages that we have been sending to Ukraine, that has been going through with congressional approval. So I think that's kind of in a different conversation, but just broadly the argument that yes, at the bare minimum, you should have to get some sort of congressional approval for the United States to send troops to go be involved in all of these different countries, whether it's Niger, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Syria as well. Yes, obviously, I mean, that is the bare minimum. Now, on top of that, of course, as I've covered a multitude of different times on this channel, we do have a lot of members of Congress who are basically in the pocket of the military-industrial complex, who are in the pocket of a lot of, these special interests that are interested in the United States maintaining our presence in all of these different various countries around the world. And so, it's not a perfect system just getting that congressional approval. I mean, obviously, we had congressional approval for, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those were absolute disasters. So it's not going to be perfect just to get congressional approval for these types of, war actions that are taken by presidents in the United States. But it would basically be, again, the very bare minimum that we could ask for, that, yes, you have to get the approval from the representatives that are supposed to be representing the American people before you start going and getting us into these overseas ventures. But they have another take here from the Obama administration's ambassador to Syria, a leading voice in favor of aggressively confronting the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad at the time, and he also apparently was backing the effort by Matt Gaetz to force the U.S. withdrawal from the country within 180 days. Okay, so the guy who worked as the ambassador for Syria under the Obama administration, who really got us into this war in a real capacity, even he is coming out and now saying, yeah, we should probably pull out our troops. We don't know what the fuck we're even doing over there, right? So they say Robert Ford argued in a letter to Congress in support of Gaetz' legislation that the U.S. mission has no clear objective. Sounds kind of similar to what we were hearing about Afghanistan recently as well before we pulled out. But they say, quote, "After more than 8 years of military operations in Syria, there is no definition of what the enduring defeat of ISIS would look like," Ford writes in the letter, which was obtained by The Intercept and confirmed as authentic by Ford. And he says, "We owe our soldiers serving there in harm's way a serious debate about whether their mission is in fact achievable. Okay, again, this is the same conversation that we were having about Afghanistan, right? When Joe Biden decided to inevitably pull out of Afghanistan, obviously you had the Trump administration, they were kind of bitches about it. They didn't want to actually follow through on the pullout because they didn't want the political backlash. But the story at the end of the day was that, yes, we had to pull out of Afghanistan because it was not a winnable war in the sense that, like, you know, we were actually achieving core objectives that we went into the war trying to achieve. It was inevitable that, yes, the United States coalition was going to fall in Afghanistan, and so you had to pull out. You know, there were obviously consequences from that. Some people say it was way too chaotic and disorganized and all of that. I happen to think that was pretty much inevitable given the status of what our presence in the country actually looked like and all of the corruption and the fraud that was going on within our coalition at the time in the country. But yes, I mean, that's the main point here, is like the mission of what the United States State Department, of what the U.S. military is saying we are trying to achieve in Syria. Number one, it's vague. Number two, it's not even clear that it's even remotely achievable in the first place. And you're putting, obviously, our own troops in harm's way. You're also contributing to the ongoing destabilization of the region. And so, yes, you should have a little bit deeper conversations about what exactly the fuck we are doing with our troop presence in this country. But they continue here saying that on Tuesday evening, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, or the CPC, circulated a message to its membership urging a yes vote, producing a serious bipartisan coalition, saying this measure to remove unauthorized deployment of U.S. armed forces in Syria unless a specific statutory authorization is enacted within 6 months is largely consistent with previous bipartisan efforts led by CPC members to terminate such unauthorized military presence within 1 year, for which 130 House Democrats voted yes last year. And I think they're talking about the one that was introduced by Jamal Bowman. But again, you know, you like to get a little bit of, wins here from the Congressional Progressive Caucus. I feel like most of what I've been doing and talking about them recently has just been some of their abject failures when it comes to strategy, when it comes to certain policies that they don't support. But on this one, it looks like, at least at the surface level, they were on the right side of this. And we have another take here from Ro Khanna from California. He says, and they say he voted for the resolution, and he said attitudes toward U.S. involvement in foreign conflict were shifting on both sides of the aisle. He says there is a new generation of thinking on two central issues. Number one, a concern about wars and entanglements over the last 20 years that have not made us safer, and a concern over the offshoring of our domestic production over bad trade deals that have left the working class and middle class poorer, things like NAFTA, right? So he's 100% correct on that take. And he says, I believe that this new generation of political leaders can help fix those two mistakes that the country has made, and that there is an emerging consensus that we should not have our troops fighting overseas without congressional authorization. And again, that's the main point at the end of the day. They're trying to push to basically just have Congress authorate our war maneuvering, which is like literally what the purpose of the Congress is, right? That's part of one of their jobs, is to authorize the use of military force. Now, you know, you have things like the 2002 authorization for the use of military force and all of that was used to get us into Afghanistan, and those have been like extended and interpreted in a multitude of different ways to try to get us into other different wars in other different countries, and just extended to a completely ridiculous extent, right? So I mean, that's a good point that he's making there, is that, you know, some of these wars that we are fighting overseas, some of our troop presence overseas is not even based on like the loosest possible interpretation of what an actual authorization for the use of military force from Congress could in a good faith way be interpreted as. I mean, like in Syria, for example, it's like we do not have a legitimate congressional authorization. That's the job of Congress, right? You're not supposed to be able, as an administration, to just go around waging a bunch of different wars overseas with no approval from Congress. You have to get that. But again, they've been using all of these different weaselly ways over the last couple of decades to get us involved in all of these different wars overseas without getting that actual congressional approval. So that would basically, again, be like step one to reining in our overseas ventures. But they continue saying that Gates' introduction of the resolution, particularly with such a short timetable that would doom it to a lopsided defeat, kicked off a flurry of lobbying to try to turn it into a bipartisan coalition involving progressive groups like Just Foreign Policy and Demand Progress, and conservative ones such as Freedom Works, Concerned Veterans for America, and Citizens for Renewing America. But the speed with which it came to the floor left little time for grassroots mobilization, and they say, quote, the CPC has been leading on this front and nothing has changed change. This is from Ilhan Omar here. I wish Gates worked more closely with the coalition of groups that have been working on this and the CPC. And she continues saying, nonetheless, I am a yes on the resolution. So credit to Ilhan Omar and the other members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus who actually did vote in favor of this resolution. But I think she does have a good point there to be made, which is like, if we're going to do this, you got to do it right. I think the original bill that Matt Gaetz was trying to put forward on this was like a 15-day window to pull out of Syria, which like that's obviously not going to garner much, bipartisan across the board support. It's kind of like a, too short of a timetable. You need to actually lay it out in a realistic way that could actually be, seriously followed. But, she makes some good points on that. And they continue saying that in 2019, Gaetz and a handful of other Republicans backed President Donald Trump's push to end the U.S. presence over there, and were joined by Ilhan Omar and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who bucked the party and backed Trump's proposal to withdraw. But like Trump's Afghanistan withdrawal, he never actually did it. He just didn't do it, right? Losing the internal power struggle to supporters of a continued occupation. And that is just such classic Trump there, right? I mean, this is a guy who ran multiple campaigns on the Iraq war was a disaster, the Afghanistan war was a disaster, and he was right to critique those things. But then when it came down to it, he was just entirely cucked by the intelligence community. He was entirely cucked by the State Department, the military-industrial complex. That's what he was doing, right? I mean, that's again why he didn't want to pull out of Afghanistan under his administration. He started the initial, deal making with the Taliban at the time, but he didn't want to catch that flack. And I think he just listened to a lot of those ghouls who were around him, who were super, super hawkish people. I mean, don't forget, this is the same guy, Donald Trump. While he's pretending to be like this massive anti-war person, right? This is the same guy who hired Mike Pompeo. Okay, this is the same guy who hired John Bolton. Okay, who probably has, if anybody was going to be compared to like Henry Kissinger in terms of like the amount of coups that they would want to do within a single human lifespan, you would have somebody like, John Bolton getting up close to the top of that list. But that's who Donald Trump was, right? I mean, he was just cut to the people who were around him, who were whispering in his ear that he would come out and say, oh, I want to pull out of this, I want to pull out of that overseas venture. And then they, whisper something in his ear and he just completely gives up on the fight, which is pathetic, which is absolutely, cucked behavior there from Donald Trump, which is classic for him, his typical standard there. But they continue saying that the legal rationale for the U.S. occupation is dubious at best. Okay, so this is interesting. They say, with ISIS suppressed, the administration has suggested the purpose of the occupation is to act as a bulwark against Iran. Okay, and they're going to get to a quote here about what exactly they're talking about. But as a bulwark against Iran, I mean, that's the justification that you're going with here. I mean, again, as they point out there, the initial justification was like, oh, we need to go in there to beat back ISIS to some extent, right? Now they're just saying, like, we're just using this as an opportunity to try to, mildly harm one of our political adversaries within the region. Okay, so a translation of this, what they're saying here is just, we as the empire, we as the most powerful and wealthy country on the earth with the most powerful military force on the planet, okay, we just get to be the world police. That's what they're saying here. They're saying we can just go park our troops, we can go park our military in some other country without permission, invading them, right? Okay, typically we've been tending to occupy the oil fields, as Donald Trump admitted just a couple of years ago, but occupying a portion of a country, and they're just admitting that, like, we're just doing this to fuck with Iran. I mean, like, that's the justification that you're going with. I mean, who the fuck do you think you are? I mean, these people are absolutely deranged to just have that audacity, that mindset to be like, we can go wherever the fuck we want as long as it is even mildly in the service of our geopolitical agenda within the region. But they get into more details of that here, saying that the balance of power in Syria's multi-sided conflict depends on the American presence. Where U.S. troops retreat, American officials see an opening for the Syrian military or forces from Russia or Turkey to advance. Some U.S. officials have stressed that the American deployment precludes Iranian forces from establishing a land bridge that would allow them to more easily supply weapons to to Hezbollah allies in Lebanon. And they say it's about keeping a balance, said one senior official, speaking on the condition of anonymity, of course, because he was not authorized to speak with the media. But it's about keeping a balance, really? Is that what it's doing? Is Syria like a very well-balanced country right now because of our actions? Is the Middle East a real balanced region of the world right now because of the American presence, because of the American, war ventures overseas over the last couple of decades? I mean, again, what an absolutely insane thing to say out loud. But Also, just on the fact of the matter in terms of the land bridge, we had pushback here from, again, this former Obama administration officials. So they say, in fact, Iran already has a direct land bridge through eastern Syria to Lebanon. The U.S. occupation merely adds some time to the Iranian trucker's journey. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. When they say, we're doing this, we have this presence in Syria to act as a bulwark against Iran, what are you talking about? You're talking about adding adding a little bit of time to the truck journey of this supply chain that is going from Iran to Hezbollah? I mean, like, what are we really talking about here? I mean, it's just absolutely insane. But they say, more to the point, said Ford, there is no authorization to deploy troops overseas to counter Iran. Yeah, the 2001 authorization for the use of military force was all about Al-Qaeda and, to a secondary extent, the Taliban and Afghanistan, he said. It wasn't about Iranian or pro-Iranian militias in eastern Syria. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. Like, they just stretch these definitions, stretch the authorization for the use of military force, and just, like, pretend as if that applies to the current situation. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. But they say, quote, "For me, it's important to plant a stake around tightening things up on the War Powers Act." Okay, this the statement, by the way, I forgot to read this top paragraph, actually just completely skipped over that. But so this is from Vermont's newly elected Democratic Representative Becca Balint, okay, who voted for the resolution, but she has some concerns about the Syrian Kurds, right? I think to at least some degree justifiably so. But she says, "For me, it's important to plant a stake around tightening things up on the War Powers Act, but also making sure that there is long-term support in place for the Syrian Kurds." Right. I mean, you don't want to just abandon people who've been fighting alongside us for a long time. The Kurds obviously have just been absolutely decimated by a multitude of different other actors in the region and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, you don't want to just, like, leave them hanging out to dry after all this time, right? She says, a lot of people are talking about the Kurds, and it's a concern so many of us have. I have a 15-year-old son, and I was just talking to him about this last night. One of the things that we talked about is that there are always people involved in a conflict between two sides, and we can lose sight of those people in the long term. It's critical that we make sure that those people are protected. And I think she's correct about that. But they continue here, and we're just going to finish off here. They say, Ford argued that the U.S. withdrawal would facilitate the kind of negotiations needed to bring a measure of stability to the region. Okay, so kind of an inverse perspective of what the military-industrial complex is saying here. They're saying we need the presence in Syria to maintain stability. He has a different perspective here. Again, this guy worked under the Obama administration. He says pulling out would actually, deliver a more significant degree of stability to the region, saying that the Kurdish separatists, while enjoying significant amounts of autonomy, would be pushed into direct talks with the Syrian government over a power-sharing agreement, and the Turks have resisted talks with the U.S. over security at the Syrian border, angered at the U.S. alliance with the Kurdish separatists. And he says, quote, "We have enough leverage, in my view, with Turkey to help protect the Kurds," this from Rokana, said when he was asked about whether he shared Balint's concern. And he says, "We could provide the Kurds with aid and support like we have in Ukraine, and if the president wants to make the case about a certain presence that is required for America to protect the Kurds, then he should come to Congress and work with us to make that case." Okay, so again, you could have plenty of different criticisms about our ongoing aid packages to Ukraine and all of that, and whether or not the United States actually has good intentions for Ukraine or for the Kurds. I mean, really, in my opinion, these are just like pawns. These are, from the perspective of the military-industrial complex, they don't really care about the Ukrainians. They don't really care about the Kurds, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about these people, right? I mean, obviously, again, there's many debates about, like, whether or not, supplying weapons to different groups of people or different factions, or, as Rokana was suggesting here, I guess, like, putting a limited amount of troops to actually help the Kurds on the ground. I mean, again, I think that would be highly questionable. But at the end of the day, I mean, his point here that he finishes off here, I think, is accurate, which is that, yeah, you should at the bare minimum have to go through Congress to make any of this happen, right? You shouldn't just be able to unilaterally continue with these ongoing endless wars overseas. And I think that's the fundamental point here. So I'll finish the video off here just by telling you guys that I'm going to link this down below in the description. If you want to go and check, which representatives were no votes against this piece of legislation, which ones were yes votes against this piece of legislation, then I'll put that down in the description if you want to go check what your specific representative was doing. But at the end of the day, again, this is just the classic bipartisan, pro-war caucus, pro-war duopoly, pro-military industrial complex caucus that we have within our government, where they are always going to be in favor of extending these endless wars with no clear objectives that are, destabilizing different regions around the world, causing endless suffering and needless suffering around the world. And so, yes, of course, we should be pulling out of Syria. We should be pulling out of any of these unauthorized military ventures overseas, and actually pushing for even just the bare minimum of accountability for the executive branch when it comes to waging some of these actions.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying